How did colonialism affect the Islamic world militarily and politically in general, and specifically in Lebanon? How did colonialism affect the Islamic world's culture in general, and specifically in the case of religion in the subcontinent? How did colonialism affect the Islamic world's economy in general, and specifically in Western Africa? What is modernity? What are the four ways modernity and Islam interact? Define Muslim modernism, Wahhabism, Bid'ah, and Islamism. The first human development in world history that really affects almost everyone everywhere directly are the various forces that are collectively referred to as colonialism. Colonialism is the shorthand for the spread of Western European influence around the globe. Suddenly, the small nations of the western half of Europe, Britain, France, Spain, Portugal, Germany, the Netherlands, and Italy, sprung onto the world stage and became the dominant players in global events nearly everywhere. How did this happen? Western Europe was rarely a major factor on the international scene before the modern period. Cold climates prevented significant amounts of production needed for export and kept the population small when compared to the Middle East, Central Asia, Central Africa, the Indian subcontinent, and China. The notable exception came in the form of the Roman Empire, which ruled from the center of the Italian peninsula. But even this is deceptive. The economic, military, and cultural force of the Roman Empire was not found in the West, but in the East. The Romans were fed and clothed with Egyptian grain and cloth, fought with Syrian metals, and traded with Central Asians and Indians. And even today, one can see much more Roman architecture and other remains in the Arab world than in the Western one. Following the fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 CE, Western Europe fragmented into a number of local kingdoms under various dynastic aristocracies. Rarely did any of them wield significant influence beyond their homelands. The Western Middle Ages can quite easily be characterized by local lords and monarchs acting on a regional scale. Even the largest political unit of the Western Middle Ages, the Holy Roman Empire, was at its zenith in the 12th and 13th centuries only about 500 miles across, from the Baltic Sea to central Italy. The domains of French, Italian, and British Christian rulers and Spanish Muslim caliphs were considerably smaller. Even at the height of their powers, the various Christian and Muslim kingdoms of the West were nothing compared to their political counterparts in the East, the Christian Byzantine Romans, the Muslim Umayyads and Abbasids, and the great civilizations of India and China. And Western powers lagged behind all of them in technology, wealth, literature, science, and military political might. This started to change in the wake of the Mongol invasions in the 13th and 14th centuries. Many of the great power centers of the Asian landmass were either destabilized or completely destroyed. The Abbasid Seljuk dynasty was crushed by Hulagu Khan in 1258, while his brother Kublai Khan ended the Chinese Song dynasty in 1279. The Mongols of the same period periodically attacked the Roman Byzantines, the Russians, the Poles, the Ukrainians, the Croats, the Czechs, the Hungarians, and the Austrians. But most importantly, the Mamluks in Egypt successfully defeated the Mongols at the decisive Battle of Ain Jalut in Palestine in 1260. This would prove to be the early Mongols' only major loss on the battlefield, permanently preventing their conquest of Africa and, beyond that, the Western European world. Certainly one of the most important single battles in world history, the events at Ain Jalut would move the political might of the Islamic world to the Mediterranean, first to Mamluk Egypt, and then to the Turkish Ottomans, while sparing Africans and Western Europeans from the Mongol onslaught altogether. The breakthrough for the West would come in the following centuries. The Mongol conquests and the various Khanate empires that they created not only decimated the political and cultural order of Asia, they strengthened the so-called Silk Road radically. Since ancient times, various routes brought trade and wealth across Asia to the distant west from the distant east. The Islamic and Indian peoples were by far the greatest beneficiaries of these systems, as goods that traveled in either direction would make their way through their marketplaces and therefore would always be subject to their taxes. Items that were easily found and cheaply produced in Asia, like spices, dyes, books, precious stones, gold, steel, ink, sugar, silk, citrons, porcelain, carpets, paper, and later gunpowder, would increase exponentially in price by the time they arrived in Western Europe. Common wares in the Asian world were luxury goods in the remote West, if they were available at all. The Mongol dominance of the trade routes made these products cheaper and more available in Asia, but even more expensive in Western Europe. Therefore, the Western European kingdoms learned to circumvent the land routes completely by turning to the sea. Those Westerners who benefited from this first were the Iberians, that is, the Portuguese and the Spanish, and the Italians, the Venetians, Florentines, and Genoese. The latter dominated the Mediterranean, and the former the Atlantic. The need for foreign luxury goods, once provided by the Silk Road, pushed these Western kingdoms further into Africa than they'd ever gone before, and in 1492, the American continents appeared on the European horizon. While medieval Western European technology paled in comparison to that of the Eastern Christians, the Asian Muslims, and the Chinese, their technologies were significantly more advanced than the Central and Southern Africans and the indigenous peoples of America. The violent subjugation of the southern half of Africa and the American continents opened a floodgate of wealth for the Iberians and Italians, and the British, French, Dutch, and Germans soon afterward. Following this wealth, Western technology exploded, especially those needed to create, maintain, and expand European power: navigational technology, the ship, the cannon, and, most especially, the gun. Counter to this, the rise of European wealth from colonialism weakened the trade economy of Asia. Not only were Western Europeans becoming richer, their wealth was making the Muslims of the Asian and African worlds poorer. The poorer Asians and Africans became, the more easily they were subjugated by Europeans, creating a feedback loop. The weaker the Islamic, Indian, and Chinese peoples of Asia and Africa became, the more easily they were colonized. The more they were colonized, the more powerful the Europeans became, leading to more economic collapse and more European colonies in new places. Colonialism is the first single human historical process which we might rightly refer to as global. While the Romans, Persians, Arabs, and Mongols colonized huge parts of the map, the European invasions of the early modern period affected nearly every people everywhere. Almost every land on Earth has been subject to at least one European colonial invasion. And even those few that were never directly invaded by a political power or like a European military force were affected by European powers in other indirect but often more long-lasting ways. The scale of this process therefore prevents us from making any simple observations about what colonialism means generally. Not only were there many European powers colonizing the world, how these different colonizers impacted different non-Europeans varied dramatically. For instance, Eastern North America, Western Central Africa, and the Indian subcontinent were all colonized by England. However, there is little that we can observe about the shared history of these places, even though they were all subject to the same one power. The colonial history of Canada is not the colonial history of the United States, and neither of these are the colonial history of Sierra Leone, Liberia, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, or Bangladesh. Even though all of these nations are somehow the direct creation of British colonization, how that process worked in each setting is entirely distinct. So, how much more can we say about the colonization of, let's say, the Algerians by France, or the southwestern American nations by the Spanish, the Brazilians by the Portuguese, or the South Africans by the Dutch? That said, there are four major processes that we can speak of as the general effects of European colonialism: military invasion, cultural invasion, economic invasion, and psychic invasion. Collectively, we can speak of these four phases of colonialism as modernity. Modernity is the name for the civilization of Western Europe between roughly 1500 and 1970, and how that civilization transformed the non-Western peoples of the rest of the planet politically, culturally, economically, and mentally. That is, colonialism is the process that spread this worldview that we call modernity. Now, strictly speaking, modernity is not significantly different than the spread of other colonial civilizations like the Romans, the Arabs, or the Mongols, which each, in their own ways, transformed politics, cultures, economic systems, and mental landscapes. However, where modernity is different is scale. Modernity is global, while Rome, the Umayyads and the Abbasids, and the Mongol Khanates are not. The Roman conquest of Egypt in 30 BCE means nothing to the Mayans. But there's no outside to European colonial modernity. Everyone has been modernized somehow. And while modernity grew up in Western Europe, it's now local to nearly everywhere. In the most obvious sense, colonialism is the creation of political colonies, military invasions. A European power, British, French, Spanish, Portuguese, German, Dutch, or Italian, arrives in a foreign land and takes control by military force. This happened under Napoleon, who invaded Egypt in the name of France in 1798. Or the gradual British invasion of the Indian subcontinent, which held the entirety of what is now Pakistan, India, and Bangladesh by 1858. Military invasion brings in its wake a number of political transformations, which last even after a colonial power is thrown out or replaced. For a lasting example, European military colonialism introduced the distinctly European notion of the nation-state. Wherever Europeans went, they imposed this particular vision of how political power was to be structured on the people that they conquered. And this is why every inhabitable part of the earth now is considered to be part of at least one nation-state, a country. A nation-state suggests a centralized system of government which rules from a capital city and whose rule extends to fixed borders which can, in theory, always be pinpointed on a map. Undergirding the political unit of the nation-state is some notion of a shared identity of the people living within that state. Usually the shared identity is ethnic, linguistic, or religious. For instance, in 1920, the French, through the League of Nations mandate, claimed the area of the Eastern Mediterranean, which has since antiquity been referred to as Lebanon. A number of semi-autonomous regions with various Sunni, Shiite, Maronite Christians, Orthodox Christians, and Druze populations were combined together by the government of France to create the State of Greater Lebanon. After the French were expelled between 1941 and 1946, the region retained this colonial political designation as the Lebanese nation-state, that is, Lebanon, centered around a supposed shared identity of being ethnically Arab, religiously Muslim, and speaking the particular dialect of Lebanese Levantine Arabic. However, the European cultural invention of the nation-state comes with a number of drawbacks. Fixed borders require multiple, independent nation-states to agree upon them, and therefore having borders can easily lead to conflict. In the case of Lebanon, this can be seen in the continued military clashes with their neighbor Israel. And centering a government around a capital city and a supposedly shared identity likewise invites internal conflict over minority rights and political autonomy. Again, in just the case of Lebanon, 40% of the population is Christian and another 5% Druze, so aligning the nation-state with Muslim identity is problematic. Likewise, sizable Lebanese populations also speak Armenian, Greek, or Kurdish, as they have since ancient times, problematizing the nation-state's linguistic identity too. And even further, who exactly qualifies as an Arab cannot be determined, as the designation is a fluid amalgam of homeland, culture, language, custom, and religion, and it's subject therefore to perennial debate. Internal Lebanese strife, most especially the Lebanese Civil War from 1975 to 1990, has repeatedly been between these various groups, each of whom must jostle for power and representation in a nation-state constructed by outsiders. The nation of Lebanon was designed on French maps, not Lebanese ones. So even the idea of Lebanon often has not accounted for the complexity, history, and diversity of the Lebanese peoples themselves. Comparable phenomena occurred in the hundreds of other nation-states created by the process of European colonialism. Some nation-states, by the way, try to circumvent this sense of ethnic, linguistic, or religious identity by instead employing some notion of citizenship. In these cases, the political value of ethnic identity is shifted towards one's immediate ancestry. Citizenship is still determined by birth, like ethnicity is. That is, citizens are the children of citizens, or by political religious affiliation that gives way to a nationalistic affiliation. A citizen must somehow ritualistically devote themselves by allegiance to the nation-state. But here too, minority and migrant groups fall outside of that political order. Nearly a third of the people of Lebanon are refugees from Palestine, Iraq, or Syria. How such refugee and migrant communities fit into the modern notion of the nation-state is a global problem, as such people by definition must ignore borders and identity, often in the name of their own survival. The second major process of European colonialism is cultural invasion. That is, the presence of a European government, either because they're the rulers or are strongly manipulating the rulers, transforms the norms, identities, and ideologies of a given people and place. Now, let's look at the example of the greater subcontinent: modern Pakistan, India, Bhutan, Nepal, Bangladesh, and Sri Lanka, which was the crown jewel of the British Empire from 1857 to 1947. Before the British colonization process began politically, most of the region was under the dominance of the Muslim Mughal Sultanate, one of the descendant empires of the Mongols. The Mughal period marked one of the high points for Indian civilization in terms of culture, art, architecture, and science. This period was known for its cosmopolitan cultural identity. While the rulers were ethnically Mongol Muslims, their subjects were remarkably diverse in culture, identity, and language. The Emperor Akbar I assembled what might be rightly called the first Parliament of World Religions, inviting members of dozens of different groups into his court. Major translation projects moved literatures across Indian languages as well as into the court language of Persian. With the assent of the British, many of the cultural norms of Greater India were replaced by British European inventions, which were less adapted to the specific needs of the people of the subcontinent. Of note here is the distinctly modern Western notion of religion. As far back as the Quran itself, Muslims have had a notion of deen, recompense, or repayment. Deen is roughly the cultic moral norms by which one repays God and one's people for their help and protection, and hopefully will someday be repaid in turn on Judgment or Repayment Day, the Day of Deen, as the Quran calls it. Similarly, non-Muslim Indians had a comparable notion of dharma, the duty to one's family, society, and cosmos, and various divine powers, like gods, Buddhas, or bodhisattvas. Both deen and dharma prioritize outward actions of ritual, practice, and public ethics much more than the Western concept of religion does. Religion, compared to deen or dharma, prioritizes personal beliefs or faith, ideas or thoughts a certain individual holds to be true. One can have a private, personal religious ideology, but one cannot have a personal deen or a dharma outside of their own community. Religion is much more defined by a person's thoughts, while deen and dharma are defined by cultural activities. One Muslim can identify another through practices of Islam submission, the outward manifestations of deen. But a pre-modern Muslim has no access to another person's internal deen, like their faith, their iman, or their theology, their kalam. Religion is, therefore, divisive in a way that deen and dharma are not. Historically, internal debates amongst Muslims has, with rare exceptions, been a matter of practice and politics, the external, public dimensions of Islam. For instance, the Sunni-Shiite split is primarily over who should hold authority in a given Muslim community. The theological, personal distinction between the two sides are much more porous. A Sunni could publicly declare the virtues of the Ahlul Bayt, and a Shiite could cite as religious authorities Sunni philosophers, theologians, and sheikhs. After the imposition of the notion of religion, expressions of personal faith such as these appear more problematic, as they seem to be affirming a contrary school of thought. Sunnism and Shiism, looked at through the lens of religion, appear much more like ideologies than cultic or political designations. More radically, European colonialism's imposition of religion in India created a number of new religions, which then created ideological splits. Muslims historically referred to the various peoples of the subcontinent, Hindustan, using the Arabo-Persian term Hind, the Indians. By the Mughal period, Muslims generally considered the Hind as peoples of the book alongside Jews and Christians. They weren't Muslims, but neither were they associators, and therefore the Hind were a protected class. The Hind varied radically in belief, custom, culture, language, and ethnicity, sharing only the general identity of being from Greater India, which is about as culturally specific as being from North or South America. But often, the Hind had a roughly monotheistic notion of a single divine reality called Brahman, and revealed texts like the Vedas, many of which were translated into Persian by the Muslim Mughal prince Dara Shikoh, by the way. Many Indian shrines to holy people and poets accommodated both Muslim and non-Muslim worship, as many still do today. Mixed Muslim and non-Muslim families were typical, and possibly even more common than not. The British, and other Europeans, coupled this notion of Hind with the notion of religion, creating Hinduism. The Hind became the Hindus. Hind is a generic marker of homeland, while Hinduism is a cultural marker of personal beliefs and thoughts. Therefore, Hinduism must be fully and completely distinct from Islam, while Hind was on a continuum with Islam. Furthermore, while the Hind could practice, think, or do any number of things which may or may not overlap with Islam, the modernism Hinduism created a massive majority population of non-Muslims. During the Mughal period, the Muslims were merely one minority in a landscape with no single, clear majority cult or culture. But Hinduism, an outside invention of Europe, was a catch-all. Nearly any Indian who did not consider himself a Muslim, Christian, Jew, or Buddhist would just be called a Hindu. And therefore, the Hindus became the majority population in India by simply changing how people were labeled. In time, and aided strongly by the British Empire's de facto policy to divide and conquer, tensions arose between Indian Muslims and the now Hindus, which sometimes continue to this day. Indeed, the British government even argued that it must rule over all India in order to prevent strife between Muslims and Hindus, while conveniently ignoring the fact that the British themselves created that distinction. Even after the British were deposed from rule in 1947, the imposition of religion remained. The subcontinent broke into nation-states based on religious majority population. Where Muslims were the majority became Pakistan and Bangladesh. Where Hindus were the majority became India. Even the ancient language Hindustani divided along religious lines. The Hindus spoke Hindi, while the Muslims spoke Urdu, even though Hindi and Urdu are mutually intelligible. Naturally, the cultural invasion of the notion of religion played out differently elsewhere. And likewise, neither was religion the only European cultural norm propagated by colonialism. Art, science, race, culture, and sexuality are all completely Western ideas, with no clear non-Western, pre-colonial analogues anywhere. The concept of nation-state could also be included here. Colonialism made each of these cultural thoughts nearly universal, even though each was only designed specifically to explain Western European civilization. Therefore, how well each of these thoughts grafts onto any specific place or people is highly variable. The control of Europeans wasn't only political or cultural. The most tangible power of the colonial project was the theft of non-European products and often people. So, for example, Indonesia, today's largest Muslim nation, was not only repeatedly invaded by the Portuguese, Spanish, Dutch, and British between the 16th and 19th centuries, the massively lucrative spice trade was now owned by Europeans, not the Indonesians who actually produced the spices themselves. Similar stories of economic takeovers happened across the Islamic world, most especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where Europeans ransacked the continent in search of precious metals, stones, and spices. But unlike the colonial political units, colonies, the economic seizure of goods and people remained even after a certain European government withdrew or was cast out. The largest producers of valuable raw goods in Africa today are companies owned by Westerners, though the products and labor forces are entirely African. This means that the wealth of much of the world, both in its natural wealth and the labor of its people, is funneled into European hands, even though non-Westerners are the ones doing most of the production. And the raw goods of this production are likewise not from Europe. A clear case of this issue can be observed in Western sub-Saharan Africa. Roughly the modern nation-states of Senegal, the Gambia, Guinea-Bissau, Guinea, Mali, Sierra Leone, Liberia, Côte d'Ivoire, Togo, Benin, and Burkina Faso. In the medieval period, this area was part of or under the influence of the Empire of Mali, one of the richest pre-modern political entities on Earth due to enormous reserves of gold and other valuable metals. The Mansa, Mandika for king, Musa I, was perhaps the single wealthiest person to have ever lived. Musa's Hajj in 1324 and 1325 brought the ruler himself and his enormous entourage of 65,000 people to Egypt and then to Arabia. Their arrival, and the hundreds of tons of gold they brought with them, flooded the world market so drastically that the price of gold deflated across the Asian landmass, creating a decade-long worldwide recession. The Malians' official currency for most of their empire's history was gold dust. There was no need for them to develop an abstract system of value like coins, checks, or paper money, as gold itself was so ubiquitous and could simply be measured to the required amount needed to make a transaction. This would become the colonial Gold Coast, starting with the arrival of the Portuguese in 1471, who would later be followed by the Dutch, British, and other European powers. Aside from the military invasion of the region, Europeans could trade technological goods, especially guns and cannons, for gold and slaves. Since gold was the natural resource of the area, and enslaved peoples were by definition kidnapped, both carried enormous profit margins when exported to Europe or the Americas. At the same time, Europeans introduced the cash crop cotton from the Arabic qutn, which enslaved West Africans could produce cheaply, and therefore crashed the rival Egyptian cotton market on the other side of the continent. The private companies producing cotton and gold and exporting slaves were then seized by the British government in 1821, further pulling all of the human and natural production revenues out of African hands and into European ones. While the direct Western colonial political dominance of West Africa started to fail in the 19th century, the economic movement of wealth and people remained. Aside from the human cost of enslaved West Africans who were moved to the Americas, a violent transformation beyond the calculation of any economics, control of West African gold, cotton, timber, and other goods remained in the hands of Western companies as it does to this day. Similarly, the British also introduced cacao trees to the region in 1878 as a new cash crop. The example of the cacao trees still remains, as chocolate, a product deeply associated with European culture, cannot be produced in Europe. Similar histories could be told for other European cultural staples like coffee, that is, kahwa from Ethiopia and Arabia, tea, shai or chai from India and Central Asia, pepper, pipali from South and Southeast Asia, diamonds from Central and Southern Africa, vanilla from East Africa and Madagascar, and on and on. The most difficult aspect of colonialism to trace on paper is the interior effects of modernity on individuals and groups. These transformations and inventions are almost always invisible in the public sphere, save on the rare occasion when they manifest as politics, such as in a violent revolution or protest. Further complicating the matter, the mental or psychic invasion of colonialism is often unnoticed even by the affected individuals. More often than not, even the rejection of European modernity is based on equally modern assumptions. To mentally defy a worldview is first to understand said worldview, which means that one is also employing it. It's one thing to fight an external colonial government such as a foreign invader. It's quite something else to repel the invasion of one's own mind. Regarding Islam, which, like modernity, is now a global phenomenon, there are roughly 4 responses to colonial modernity which played and play out in the interior lives of people, in their personal faith, their worldviews, and their conception of what is common sense. The vast majority of Muslims, while perhaps unhappy with particular political, economic, and social effects of colonialism, also see value in various aspects of modernity. Such a Muslim might be perfectly, or with minor reservations, content with modern science and technology, European political systems like nation-states, democracy, republics, or fascism, European American economic systems like capitalism, socialism, or communism, and modern forms of identity such as race or citizenship. Regarding Islam, it is a proper religion in the Western understanding of that term. Therefore, Islam is a subject of internal, personal belief, ethics, and thought, with little or no legal dimension. That is, there is some unseen core of thought, faith, and morality called Islam, which has manifested in individuals across 14 centuries of history. While Islam has on many occasions appeared in the form of political units, who in various ways attempt to apply Islam as law, that's incidental. Islam itself is deeply personal and roughly independent of secular authorities such as governments, scholarly communities, courts, or caliphs. Islam is only to be found in particular people, where it manifests as piety, righteousness, and adoration of God. External aspects of Islam, which may be in conflict with modern life, can be deliberately reinterpreted if they're not in accord with the perceived rights of the individual. Like most modern religions, the individualism of modernist Islam usually does not lead to fixed social institutions, and therefore it's difficult to plot who might be properly called a Muslim modernist. Muslims who practice modern science, or argue for Muslim feminisms or Muslim LGBTQ liberation, secular Muslims, or reformers who push for communism, liberal democracy, or socialism would all fit into this category in their own various ways, as would most Western Muslims. The next largest group are those who are comfortable with modern technology and thought, but not content with the wholesale affirmation of Western culture. Like the modernists, the Islamist wants to reread the Quran and the Sunnah to meet the needs of the present situation. However, they reject the central Western differentiation between the religious, which is private, and the secular, which is public. The classical textual sources are not only laying out spiritual principles and moral guides, but specific legal and political practices that are just as intrinsic to Islam as personal faith. Islam is, in some regard, to be the official policy of one's government. The form that government may take will vary from autocratic to representational, as does the given interpretation of Islam, but one's government should be at least informed by Islam, if not guided by it. In the Shiite sphere, the appearance of Islamism came to the fore most notably in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. The forces of Ruhollah Khomeini installed an Islamic republic based both on the liberal principles of modernity, that is, elections and individual rights, and Islamic legal and moral authority. For Sunnis, the Egypt-based Muslim Brotherhood, Jamiat al-Ikhwan al-Muslimin, moves between the categories of religious charity and political party in numerous international manifestations, all of which somehow seek to ground local laws in Quranic and prophetic tradition. While occasionally being linked directly or indirectly with political violence, the Brotherhood has repeatedly denied any endorsement of violence against civilians. But regardless of whether and how the Muslim Brotherhood commits violence themselves in any given case, their primary role is as a political alliance, with standing committees and official chains of command, based at once on Western political models, corporate models, and the hierarchies of Sufi tariqas. They also have significant influence outside of Egypt as well, with large numbers of elected officials in the governments of Sudan, Afghanistan, Palestine, Tunisia, and Yemen. Other Muslims, much fewer in number, are significantly less trusting of Western influence. These Muslim traditionalists may even reject some forms of modern technology. Islamic institutions of politics, education, culture, and society, which are considered traditional, are to be favored in all situations, although which institutions those may be vary by group. The most influential traditionalist tendency in modern Islam is so-called Wahhabism. Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab was from the provincial central Arabian territory of the Najd. Strongly anti-modern and anti-Western, Abdul Wahhab considered any Islamic thought or practice not explicitly spelled out by the Quran or the Sunni Hadith as bid'ah, religious innovation. That is, making up something that's absolutely not spelled out by the Quran or what he considered to be sound Hadith. This would include pretty much all of Shi'ism, Sufism, the celebration of the Prophet's birthday called Mawlid, most poetry, Islamic music, representational art, philosophy, and the overwhelming majority of pre-modern religious Islamic scholarship. This dismissal of all modern and most Islamic culture as bid'ah assumes that the norms of the 18th century Najd region of Arabia, which is famously barren and thus never home to intellectual or cosmopolitan forms of Islam, are traditional, while the norms of other places and other peoples, who are also Muslims, are not traditional. While by no means the only Islamic traditionalist movement, Wahhabism has cultivated a great deal of social force beyond Arabia for several semi-coincidental reasons. First, Abdul Wahhab made an allegiance with the ascendant House of Saud, who were then consolidating their political and economic force to in time become the royal family of Arabia. Hence, when Saudi Arabia was founded in 1932, Wahhabism was the official interpretation of Islam that that nation state would adopt. Second, the supposedly old-fashioned Arabness of the Wahhabi movement, coupled with the Saudi control of Mecca, Medina, and the Hajj, is often interpreted as a kind of legitimacy by many Muslims and non-Muslims alike. Third, the modern oil wealth of the Saudi state has granted that government considerable power beyond their own borders. News outlets, publications, and television programs which assume or argue for Wahhabi forms of Islam are common across the Islamic and Western world, most especially in Arabic-speaking places. The groups variously labeled terrorists, extremists, or fundamentalists are by far the smallest Islamic response to modernity and colonialism, but their political violence makes them especially noticeable. While always claiming to be traditionally Islamic in some sense, this loose collection of organizations are the least informed by classical expressions of Islamic thought, government, or culture. While perfectly at home with modern technology, the Muslim militant sees modernity as otherwise inherently, violently opposed to Islam, and therefore one is obliged to fight both colonial governments, European as well as American and Israeli, as aggressors. At the same time, the overwhelming target of the militants are other Muslims, who are dismissed as heretics, functional non-Muslims, innovators, that is, people who practice bid'ah, and who are co-conspirators with the colonizers. While such groups and individuals may all be called anti-colonial in some sense or another, their exact opinions, actions, and organizations vary wildly. The Mujahideen, the strugglers, were guerrilla fighters from around the world who came to Afghanistan to try to stop the Soviet Union's invasion in 1979. One of these Mujahideen, a Saudi Arabian named Osama bin Laden, would later found the international organization Al-Qaeda, the Foundation, in 1988. Bin Laden claimed that Al-Qaeda's goals were to expel non-Muslim military forces from traditionally Islamic lands, notably the American military from Saudi Arabia, and to remove non-Muslim economic and political entities from traditionally Islamic countries, especially the State of Israel. Boko Haram, based in northern Nigeria and founded in 2002, tries to remove the influence of Western culture and politics there. Their immediate concern is with the presence of foreign cultural power. The name Boko Haram is a mixed phrase from Hausa and Arabic, meaning Western education is forbidden. And the group which calls itself the Islamic State in Iraq and in the Levant, Ad-Dawlat al-Islamiyya fi Iraq wa Sham, called ISIS, ISIL, or Daesh in English, appeared around 1999 to fight Shiite political power in Syria, and later, in 2014, claimed to be re-establishing the caliphate. How did colonialism affect the Islamic world, militarily and politically, in general, and specifically in Lebanon? How did colonialism affect the Islamic world's culture in general, and specifically in the case of religion in the subcontinent? How did colonialism affect the Islamic world's economy in general, and specifically in Western Africa? What is modernity? What are the four ways modernity and Islam interact? Define Muslim modernism, Wahhabism, Bid'ah, and Islamism.